It's Tuesday, August 20th, 2024. We are 76 days away from the election. Welcome to today's Make It Make Sense mini episode. I'm Grant Herms. On the episode today, the first night of the DNC kicks off, and it was Joe Biden Appreciation Night, except for a few things. So the first night of the convention kicked off in Chicago last night, and what was supposed to be about a 4-hour main program turned into like a 6-hour-long one because the pre-programming ran long. Now, there was a parade of Democratic leaders from all over the country who spoke, including a part of the night where a bunch of lieutenant governors spoke, which was weird and obscure, but they seemed to be having fun, so I guess, who were we to stop them? Mostly the speakers last night spent time comparing and contrasting the Biden-Harris administration to Trump. They took shots at Trump for things like being a felon or having been found liable for sexual assault. They also took a lot of looks back at what the country was like before Biden took office, which if you haven't watched any videos from 2020 when the pandemic was at its height, you really should, because it's worth remembering what it was like. It was, I think, like a lot of us have sort of blocked out what that period was, or because the news cycle moved so fast and we rushed back into normal life after the stay-at-home orders were lifted, none of us ever got to take a breath. So watching these images were striking and evocative, just to see the footage of the pandemic when it was at its worst, and frankly, to hear Trump's voice talking about the pandemic in those daily press conferences. I think in a lot of ways, this election, even though it hasn't been framed this way, is all about how we never got the chance to take a breath after the pandemic, and I think that's a topic for the Substack, though. Anyway, the convention also got a surprise address from Kamala Harris, which is huge. Usually the candidates do not talk to the convention until the final night, but as much as the first night was about looking back at Joe Biden's presidency, it was also about him passing the torch. Now, Harris was greeted to a deafening amount of applause and cheers. When the cameras cut to seats where her husband and the Walzes were, you could see they were genuinely surprised to see her on stage. In fact, the second gentleman, Doug Emhoff, could be seen telling the person next to him that he didn't know that was going to happen. And Tim Walz looked like they just told him he was going to be Miss K of the Milky Way at the Minnesota State Fair, and they were going to carve his face out of butter, which, if you don't know what I'm talking about, just Google it. It's not weird. It's wholesome, I promise. Now, Harris gave some brief remarks, thanking Biden, and really did mark the point of the night where things went from talking a lot about electing Kamala Harris and the Harris-Biden administration and their successes to really being about Joe Biden. I also want to say here, too, Harris was in a tan suit, which only matters because these things are choreographed, and if you don't think that it was somebody's job on Harris's staff to figure out which suit and which color that suit was going to be each night of the convention, you're wrong. These things are meant to send messages, and the tan suit has become a political symbol as a way for Democrats mostly to stick their tongues out at Republicans, because when Obama was in office, he gave a press conference about troops in the war on terror in the Middle East, and he was wearing a tan suit, and at that point in time, the right-wing media and Republicans pounced on that, saying that it was unbecoming of the office and disrespectful for him to wear a light-colored suit. That criticism obviously was ridiculous, but it's now become a thing for Democrats to use it as a jab to Republicans, and clearly Harris was wearing that suit last night because everybody in the room knew what she was doing. It's also here that I should describe the overall tone of the convention's first night. It was hopeful, it was electric, it was joyous. You could see the excitement in the crowd, and you could hear it in the speeches, which often at these conventions can be dull and hard to watch. And that's not to say there weren't a few clunkers. New York Governor Kathy Hochul did not exactly have a great night, but the atmosphere was so different at this convention compared to the Republican National Convention, which in a lot of ways was angry, it was fearful, it was even vengeful. And I went back and watched some of that before I wrote this, just to be sure that I wasn't misremembering anything, and it really was those things. Now, it was just after the assassination attempt of Donald Trump, and it mirrored in a lot of ways the way that Trump talks about the current state of the country, but you could also feel that the Republicans at their convention thought they had this race won. So it was also a celebration, and essentially they did have it won at that point. But even in the exuberance of the RNC, it had this other little bit of a bite to it that wasn't there at the DNC last night. Okay, after that, there were a few more speakers, and then it was time for Hillary Clinton to speak. And I honestly did not know what this was going to be like. By and large, Democrats seem to be split into three camps on Clinton, specifically on her run for president. The first is that she was undercut by rampant sexism and misogyny, an FBI that was in the tank for Trump, and a media that was addicted to covering him. The second group is all of those things are true to these folks, but she was also just not a good candidate, and the Clinton name has sort of a proceed with caution label to it. And the third group is the people who say, why can't Hillary Clinton just go away? Now, obviously, the lines between those camps are porous, and I think often the Venn diagram for a lot of Democratic voters is really just a circle when it comes to Clinton. But her speech, based on the reaction and the tone of the room, she killed it. She lifted up Biden. She took a lot of shots at Trump. She made a joke at one point about getting more votes than he did, which is true. She did win the popular vote in 2016. This convention and the days leading up to it have really been interesting for the legacy of Hillary Clinton, too, along with Joe Biden. 8 years removed from her loss to Trump, there has been a lot of talk about the historic nature of her campaign, regardless of what you think of her. She was the first woman to be at the top of a major U.S. political party's national ticket. She was also the first woman in U.S. history to win the popular vote. And if the first night of the convention is about passing the torch to Kamala Harris, then Clinton deserved to be on the stage to pass the torch that she lit and carried in 2016. Okay, speaking of torch passing, Joe Biden gave his speech. He was introduced by his daughter Ashley, who talked about her dad and who he is, someone who lived through a lot of tragedy and adversity, and not just the death of Biden's eldest son, Beau, in 2015. But if you don't know, Biden was married before he was married to Jill. His first wife and their 1-year-old daughter were killed in a car accident in 1972. Beau and Hunter were in the car, and they were badly hurt. And that happened just after Biden was elected to the Senate at 29 years old. His wife was just 30 years old. In her speech, Ashley Biden also talked about her dad as having a courageous heart and a drive to serve, which got huge applause. And when Biden finally came out to greet the crowd and his daughter, he had to stop for a minute to wipe tears away before he could get to the podium. And when he did get to the podium, he had to wait again because there were nearly 5 full sustained minutes of applause. He tried to start a few times, and every time he would, the crowd would just cheer louder. Now, before the convention, people in the audience were given signs that read things like, "Thank you, Joe," and "We heart Joe," and the entire United Center was on its feet for him. It's hard in that moment, too, not to think that maybe somewhere in his mind, he doubted his decision to step aside. You have to think that he felt that energy and saw that outpouring of gratitude and thought to himself, maybe I could have won. I mean, we do know that he thought that way before he made his decision and might still think that way based on some new reporting that came out. He still believes that he probably could have won this race, but stepped aside for the good of his party and, in his mind, the good of the country. When Biden did finally get the crowd to die down, he spoke for 52 minutes. He started by talking about his decision to run in 2020, which he's talked a lot about, especially the idea that after Beau died, he had resigned himself not to be a part of professional politics anymore, but that changed after the 2017 white supremacist march in Charlottesville, Virginia. That's the one where Trump said that there were fine people on both sides, even though one of those sides was just neo-Nazis. Biden reiterated that he saw the election in 2020 as a battle for the soul of America and preserving American democracy. Those are things that he's said a lot during his presidency, and it's pretty clear that that's part of how he wants to be remembered. Also, accomplishments over his career, the Violence Against Women Act, allowing Medicare to negotiate lower drug prices, which he did just during this administration, but it was actually the first cause he took up in the Senate when he was just 29. He talked about navigating out of the pandemic, skipping over the vaccine development, which was done under the Trump administration. And I'm sorry, Democrats, you're not going to like that, but Operation Warp Speed worked. It just did, even despite the fact now that Trump and Republicans have turned their backs on it. Biden also talked about passing things like the American Rescue Plan and the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which economists now think might have saved the U.S. from a full-blown recession and helped the U.S. recover better than almost any other major nation on the planet. He also passed the largest climate change bill in the American Inflation Reduction Act in American history. Now, I know this sounds like I'm in the tank for Biden here, but we should be honest about the fact that Biden had one of the most successful and consequential presidencies when it came to passing legislation, maybe more than LBJ and maybe more than FDR. He then said he was ready to pass the torch to Kamala Harris. He said he loves his job, but he loves his country more. And he said that he will work with his whole heart to make sure that she gets elected. And then it came time for Biden to say goodbye. He turned away from the election, from his record in office, and frankly, bared his soul a little bit to this crowd. He wanted his legacy not to be about what he got done, but why he spent 52 years in public office. He was clear that he wanted to be remembered as someone who ran for office time and time again out of a sense of duty and patriotism and service. And I think that can't and shouldn't be argued. And if you are arguing it, I don't think it's in good faith. And I think you know that. Biden also quoted a song called American Anthem, which I'm such a nerd that this hit me right in the chest. And I'm going to end this episode here, but I want you to listen to Biden's words. Here they are.
The work and prayers of centuries have brought us to this day. What shall our legacy be? What will our children say? Let me know in my heart when my days are through. America, America, I gave my best to you. I made a lot of mistakes in my career, but I gave my best to you.
Okay, that is it for today's MIMS Mini. Please rate and review the show if you liked it. It helps other people find this podcast on Apple and Spotify and wherever else you get podcasts. You can also help people find it by following the show on social media. It's MIMS News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod. It's all one word. Also, it's on YouTube now. If you're watching this video, thanks for watching. Like and subscribe, smash the bell, whatever I'm supposed to say here. You can also follow the show on the Make It Make Sense Substack, where I've got extended interviews from the full episodes and more articles and just more of how I'm thinking about this current unprecedented election. Thank you so much for watching today. I'm Grant Herms, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.